Right. So today, what I would like to talk about is really the moving on to the Stuarts, who are the next sort of major, I suppose, uh, family group. We've had the Tudors, the Tudors end, and by this point, I suppose, after quite some years, England was probably ready, in the words of at least one historian, that they were tired of female monarchs or petticoat governments, as they were often termed. And England was in a very different sort of situation than it had been before. It was at peace. Philip II of Spain had died in 1598. Spain had been the primary enemy of the English for quite some time. Henry IV of France had issued the Edict of Nantes, which stopped the French wars of religion between the Protestants and the Catholics, which had started in 1562, all the way sort of at the beginning of Elizabeth's reign. And this granted Protestants mostly the same rights as Catholics. In other words, they became a protected status, I suppose, in modern day speak. So this was the situation in England. And there's a number of different things that we need to talk about, and we'll run through this as we go through. Sorry, I'm just going to pause around here. Right. So there's a number of things that we should probably look at. First off is the economic situation in England. We had a number of bad harvests from about the 1590s onwards. And so this is not a good thing in an agricultural setting. There's outbreaks of plague that start in 1603, right at the beginning of James I's reign. This is not great, but England is doing well as a trading nation. We are exporting cloth. Exports of cloth reached between 100 and about 130,000 pounds a year, which is a lot of money, and accounts for about 4/5 of England's exports, or English exports. And the cloth trade was in the hands of the merchant adventurers, which sort of monopolized the Flanders cloth trade. And there are other outfits which I suppose have some later long-term effects on things. We have the Russia Company, the Levant Company, the East India Company, which of course would go on to gain quite a lot of notoriety. This was the beginnings, I suppose, of the British Empire, which largely centered around the spice trade at that point. But these are all small potatoes. None of these are sort of massive outfits, and it's just the beginning of things, but we are getting better. London is huge. About 1/20 of the population live in the environs of London. That's 250,000 people, which is a lot for this time period. I mean, a lot for this time period. And it eventually becomes I suppose you'd call it the commercial center of Europe by about 1700. And it attracts lots of people from the countryside. And obviously, it's when you have a lot of people, you have a certain amount of critical mass to be able to do certain things. And there are a number of things that will happen because of this. So inside London, things are, I'm not going to say great, but they're pretty good. Outside, things are not great necessarily. We've got an economic depression from about 1590 to about 1650. Some of this is centered upon, as I said, the failed harvests, and there are other sort of smaller things that depress the economy. And this is largely because England is at this point, and I use England to sort of include Wales, England is a single crop economy and is dependent on the export of unfinished cloth. Now, as any sort of modern person will tell you, having all of your eggs in one basket, economically speaking, is not very clever. And this is exactly what happened. England is dependent on a few things, and this is not good for her. The things that she has got in her favor is that she's got a large population in London, and populations in close proximity tend to generate trade, and also coal mining. But they need to find other ways of supporting the population. By between about 1500 to 1600, there's a 40% increase in the population, which is insane. And again, between 1600 and 1642, there's another 30% increase in population. So we are growing very rapidly, and things need to catch up. As I said, we are a singular crop. cereal crops are weather dependent, and if you have a bad summer, as often happened, there would be trouble. There'd be no food. The other problem is if you have a good summer, you'd have trouble because there'd be too much food, then prices go down, you have a wage slump, and then people end up economically depressed. And so what we end up with is really a floating population of generally unemployed people. And this prompts the poor laws of 1598 and 1601, which we will probably talk about actually in class when we get around to it. Outside of London, and sort of outside of the UK, really, there is chronic inflation Europe-wide. Like England, there is a general rise in population. By about 1600, the population of Europe has pretty much surpassed the point it had reached before the Black Death, and there are consequences to this. As many as a dozen cities passed the 100,000 population mark, with Naples and Istanbul and Paris reaching over 200,000 people, which are large numbers. Other cities may not have grown as much, say Lisbon or Seville, but they still grew significantly. And this has a number of consequences. This population growth really puts pressure on a country. It puts pressure on land, just as it had done all the way back in the 13th century after the Black Death. Population growth causes an increase in demand for foodstuffs and land. And the problem is this increase in demand cannot be met by increased yields. The normal sort of way we calculate this is when you plant something, you get a ratio of returned results from whatever you plant. So if you plant 1 tomato, you might get 5 tomatoes back. When it comes to cereal crops, it's only about 1 to 4 or maybe 1 to 5. So every grain that you sow, you get back 5 grains well, you get 5 grains. Now, this proportion is getting a little bit better, I suppose. People are producing more in their gardens. But the pressure on land means that there are rising rents for using that land. And the problem is that people now have to move to other lands to cultivate them. And these are very often, my apologies, very often less fertile or less accessible. And of course, this causes both demand and an inflation, which showed itself in rising foodstuffs and raw materials such as wool. So these things create costs, I suppose, much like the situation that we're in at the moment. As I said, in England, our birth rate is up. Our population is approximately, I would say, about 2 million, maybe 2.5 million. Sorry, I just accidentally clicked the wrong button there. And we're about 2.5 million by the first quarter of the 1500, but by 1600 we're up to 4 million. So that's 1.5 million people over 75 years. That's a lot of people to put into a very small area. And this means that the labor availability goes up. In other words, there's lots of people around who are able to work. But this means, as you may sort of know this already, if you've done any economics, when you've got a large labor pool, your wages go down because they can afford to be choosy about it. Also, life expectancy goes up. And that's not great. So there we go. Across England and Europe, we have a problem with inflation. Some of this might be attributed to the import of silver from the silver mines of Peru and Mexico. The Spaniards had been sort of robbing and collecting and mining from South America and sort of the Central Americas. And they had found a lot of silver. And they'd figured out a couple of technological innovations that had made the collection and the extraction of silver ore and the silver from the silver ore much easier. And so the Spanish crown, took 1/5 of everything that came in. And so between about 1500 and 1660, about approximately 185,000 kilograms of gold and approximately 16 million kilograms of silver arrived in the Spanish port of San Lucar de Barrameda. which is approximately at this point 3 times the reserves of European silver. And those numbers are not actually complete. But the problem is this silver doesn't stay in Spain. And so many, both contemporary and modern historians actually blame the Spanish for doing this. It sends the money out all over Europe, and then that means that your money devalues because there's so much of it. And so the problem with Spain is that Spain doesn't really do very much. It exports some wool, high-grade wool. It exports things like olive oil, maybe some metals, but exports don't balance the imports, which were needed. And so this had to be paid with silver. And so it's a balance of payments problem. It's not so important for us, I guess, except to point out that this is one possibility as to why we have such terrible inflation all over the place. But it does mean that your purchasing power drops. They're normally done on an index of 100, and your purchasing power at this point drops to about 72.5. So there is almost a 30% drop in your purchasing power over this sort of century or so. So anyway, that was that's the economic situation in England and on the country. There is a question that arises also about the gentry in England. What actually classifies as a gentleman? Now, of course, we've had these class structures that we talked about. We've got the peerages. If you're a duke or a marquess or an earl or a viscount or a baron, you've got those sort of peerages. They are sort of eternal positions that you can hold. Then there's the landed gentry. So these are baronets, knights, esquires, and gentlemen. And really what it means is that there is a change in the social structure coming, because if you could behave like a gentleman, you could, if you could afford it. Now, only the peerage, as I said, had a permanent caste status. But that was only on you. So if I am the firstborn in the family, I become the next duke. And if I have sons, my eldest son will become the duke, but nobody else does, just like it is on the continent. And people owned land. Of course, this is the main thing that everybody owns, whether you are, regardless of where you are in the peerage structure, and even if you're not, the point is to own as much land as you possibly can. And you own land and you begin, other people work on it. And what begins to happen is that we move from a model where other people work solely on your land, but it was really up to you now to manage it and do it well, and to acquire more land if you possibly could. And this, of course, means that your fortunes are tied to your success in managing that land and what you do with it. And if you lose that land, you lose your position as well. This includes your privileges. If you failed big time. So the instability, what we have is the instability of landed income in a period of inflation, which means that it's difficult to make money off the land. You have to have foresight and the ability to change. And the old landed gentry didn't change very quickly. The crown didn't change very quickly. It was the smaller landlords who changed quickly and innovated. So what we find is that class structures during this sort of 150-year period become much more fluid than they ever had before. I'm giving you an example from Yorkshire, which is sort of up north in England. Between about 1540 and 1642, so a 100-year period, 181 families failed in their male line. And that means that they didn't have any male heirs to carry on anything at all. 30 of them disappeared without a trace. 64 of them sold their estates and left. 87 sold up completely. Another 78 sold most of their estates. And in total, about 397 families experienced a degree of financial embarrassment which required them to sell their land. So people are losing their position. But this is important to note. The number of landed families increased from 557 in 1540 to 679 in 1642. So it's quite possible, and we will talk about this in class about the great chain of being and where you sit. It's very possible here to move up and down that chain. It is possible to become, if you like, a lord. Now, that doesn't make you a lord just because you can afford it. but it does mean that you can acquire prestige and social positions that you could never have dreamed of before. So the gentry question is a big one, and we will talk a little bit about it, but it's just something there for you to know. There are questions about the church too. Now, as you have sort of gathered over the last, I guess, few lectures or so, the church is in a very important, and has been a very important position. What do you do about it? As the short history is really, there's a very long running problem. We've started out with Henry VIII. We've moved to Edward the Sixth. We then move on to, sorry, Edward the Fourth, on to Mary and Elizabeth. And the questions are really like this: what is the English church? What is its nature? What does it teach? And what is its ministry and government? And I talked a little last time in the last lecture, I think it was, or maybe, yes, a little bit in the last lecture maybe, that, you know, we've got these different groups of people in England, and they all have slightly different expectations of what it was. So I'll start with some of these. By James's time, we have the establishment of we have an established Church of England. Now, what is the church like? Well, in many ways, the church considers, and I think in some ways still considers itself to be Catholic. And I spell Catholic here with a K at the end. Really, it's Catholic in terms of, it's not Roman Catholic, but it's Catholic in terms of it sees itself as seeing its lineage going all the way back to the apostles, much like the Roman Church does. But the Anglicans also think this too. And there are reform movements in this. Theologically, they are Calvinist. So they kind of believe in some level of predestination-led election, but not always. The established church has large portions of translated Latin for the liturgy, and this was all Edward who did this. As we pointed out in a previous lecture about the church structures, there is a change in the church layouts. But it also depends whether you are what we call high church or low church. If you are high church, I think, as I've already said once before, and this tends to be cathedrals and collegiate churches, you will have candles. Oh, hang on, I'm just going to pause while the cat gets in the way. Hang on just a second. Right. So yes, we have collegiate and cathedral churches, and they tend to be full of candles and choirs and organs and stained glass and this kind of stuff. But for everybody else, maybe what we might call low church, it's really much what you see in an Adventist church in many ways. You'd see a sort of whitewashed walls, so no decorations on the walls. You'd see a pulpit being the dominant point, because the preaching of the word is the most important part. You wouldn't have an altar. You wouldn't have an altar in the high church either, but you'd have a communion table. Now, there is no real emphasis on preaching, which is to the Puritan regret at this point. Most priests were probably unfamiliar with portions of the Bible, and they were coming under increased strain from a laity which actually wanted them to know more. And so this began to be worked upon. Various archbishops sort of put forward ideas that people needed to be educated and that the preachers need to be educated. And it unfortunately became a little too successful, because by about 1622, James had to curtail the actions of these preachers. So when the church was not, well, it depended where you were. The church could be very interested in preaching, but not all sectors of the church liked that or encouraged it. When it came to communion, it was dangerously unclear. It looks like we have some sort of element of transubstantiation, as we talked about before, but you could also read it as a Protestant and only see it as the symbolism in the bread and the wine. There's no agreed translation of the Bible, at least at the beginning of James's reign. The most common Bible, I think, at the time is the Geneva Bible, which James I would come around to trying to get rid of, mostly because it said that you could rebel against your princes. I think it was one of the glosses on the side. It didn't really like it. They didn't really allow for the possibility of always listening to your monarch. So that's the Church of England. It's a smorgasbord of a number of different theological and practical elements. When it comes to Puritanism, we have to be very careful, and I'm only going to briefly talk about this. The term has to be used very much with caution, because it is incredibly complicated, because Puritanism can be used to describe a number of things. It can be used to describe upper-class religious reformers who had returned from exile during Mary's reign. but it can also be used to describe the apocalyptic lower class radicals who backed Oliver Cromwell. It's very important to note that Puritans can't agree on things. And of course, I guess the most famous example of this is the Puritans who left the country and went to, kicked off large portions of America. And they can't agree on things such as religious reforms. They are not a coherent group of people. And they really only exist in any sort of large, significant numbers until about 1660, after which they collapse as a group. They don't last very long. But they are, if you like, the counterbalance to the Church of England. Now, there's a number of other, and we'll look at this in class, there are a number of other smaller groups of religious people with varying theological tendencies around as well. It's not just Puritans and not just Church of England. There are some other Protestant groups as well, but they are perhaps less important to the grand narrative of this. I suppose the last group, of course, is the Roman Catholics. Now, of course, this had been slightly complicated. Their lives have been complicated by the 1570 papal bull from Pius V of Regnans in Excelsis, which excommunicated Elizabeth I and all of her successors and deposed her as a monarch. So this presented a very difficult situation. You want to be seen as a worthy member, a worthy citizen, if you like, of your country, but your church officially disapproves of you doing this. And Catholics then have to risk being traitors, starting with Elizabeth, who started to strip them of their wealth, destroy Catholic worship and destroy the priesthood. They were not allowed to proselytize, which means you could go out and convert them. Jesuits were executed. But it is important to remember that this is never consistently applied. For example, you could be fined for attendance, but they didn't always bother. Later, at various points, it became better enforced than others. And as I think I mentioned in one lecture, the fine at the beginning was only a few shillings, but the fines later on, in the middle of the Catholic sort of Spain crisis, I think the cost of a fine was somewhere in the tens of pounds, which meant that you could not afford to do these things if you were a normal Catholic. You had to be exceedingly rich. And so consequently, most of the Catholics that remained ended up being in the upper classes. And there are stories of Catholics helping Protestants and Protestants helping Catholics, here, there, and everywhere. So it's important to know that none of this is consistent. It is true that probably any truce between Catholics and Protestants were destroyed by the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. And that really put the kibosh in being a Catholic. They were generally mildly tolerated by the law. Parliament, at least the lower house, was viciously anti-Catholic, and if there was any sniff of being a Catholic, you were in trouble. And this was all made worse by the fact that James was trying to make an alliance with Spain, who had been their traditional enemy for quite some years now, and was trying to marry his son to a Habsburg princess. And so this was not great. Charles I was married, ended up being married to Henrietta Maria of France, and again, a traditional English and also Catholic enemy. Not great. So our church questions are those. For the Church of England, it's really just a question of who are we? For Protestants, it's a question of what do we really stand for and how much noise are we going to make about it? And for Catholics, it's a question of keeping your head down and so you don't lose it. The next situation I want to talk about is questions of money. It's important to note that we don't have a taxation system like we are used to nowadays. The Crown gets its money based on a number of sort of what we call tonnage and poundages, which are taxes on exports and imports. So things like England is a very big exporter of wool, and so it takes a tax on that, and it imports lots of wine, so it takes a tax on that. And these are lifelong privileges. They last forever. The Crown also has its own lands, which, of course, it can farm and use to its best of its own abilities. And there are also fines and forfeits. So if somebody commits a crime and you can, depending on the severity of it, you will get fined. If it's terrible, they might take your land. Now, there are some taxes that do exist. There are what we call the 15ths and the 10ths. And these are rudimentary taxes levied on personal property. which is about 10% for townspeople and 15% for country dwellers. And it brings in very little money, only about £30,000 a year, which is not a lot, at least in terms of what monarchy required. There's also a tax called the subsidy, which is a tax on land and money. And the problem is all taxation really is sort of based upon up-to-date records, which is why governments like, at least commonly nowadays, like to keep up-to-date records of who's in the country and what they earn. The problem is the books hadn't been updated since about 1547, which meant that, for the last 60 odd years or so, we don't know what has changed. And as I pointed out, there's a lot of social movement in and out of the country, so you don't know. And the subsidy tax also had not taken into account the changes in land value, which fluctuated. And this was only done once a year. This tax was only collected that often. So again, not really a massive influx of money. The nobility, as usual, they paid very little tax, less than 10%. So there's that. The clergy tax themselves. There's something called convocation, which is, if you like, the meeting, the general conference, I suppose, for bishops. They tax themselves, and so therefore could be a little volatile in what they produced. And also these taxes can be spread over several years. So while you can issue a tax in one year, you may not actually see all of the fruits until next year. So when James I comes to the throne, there are subsidies which were voted in 1601, which are still coming into him. So things are not very quick, but they are generally paid willingly. Now, there's a caveat. During the Spanish Wars with Elizabeth I, taxes were paid more or less willingly because we're at war. But it wasn't, at the same time, it wasn't enthusiastic outside of periods like this. So, for example, a normal tax year might produce £80,000, but during the 1640s, they were getting up 80,000 a month. So the money is there, but there's not a desire to either give it or claim it. And so this is kind of a problem. On the one hand, you have to, if you are the tax collector, you've got to go around and figure out how you're going to collect this. And of course, if you are a tax giver, a payer, then you have to decide how you're going to get your money to pay for this. And these questions of money are the things that have plagued all the way through the Tudor period. They have plagued all the Tudor monarchs and will plague all of the Stuart monarchs as well. So our situation when it comes then to the Stuart monarchies, I mean, it's been said that the king can only achieve power or strength if they have money, arms, counsel, friends, and fortune. And as one historian said, when it came to counsel, they were advised poorly and into extreme situations. When it came to friends, they never had a foreign ally they could rely on. When it came to money, they were deficient because they suffered from inflation, and James also sold a lot of crown land, which of course is the basis of your money back at this point. That sets up problems later on. When it came to arms, the Tudors had no standing army, and James was a pacifist, which is not a terrible thing, but there are consequences to that. The armies themselves were full of gentlemen volunteers, and they were staffed by many Catholics, which caused a lot of suspicion. And when it came to fortune or luck, they just didn't have any, which is a tragedy, but that's how it is. But let's talk about James. James himself as a man. He is a thoughtful monarch. He's a literary monarch. He's a literary man. He writes a couple of books, the Basilicon Doron and the True Law of Free Monarchies, I think it is. So he's not stupid. He's actually sort of quite, I don't know if clever is the right word, but he's erudite, at least. When it comes to his physical appearance, he is often said to have straggling reddish hair, watery eyes, weak spindly legs, and undistinguished features. And also there's the accusation of, well, probably not latent homosexuality, but definite homosexuality in some cases. That sort of hung around, and that charge hung around him all the time. But he really is, I suppose, an accomplished king. He has organized Scotland, which has been disorganized for at least 50 years, which is pretty good. He might be considered overconfident. Scotland's a very difficult place to govern. It's very loosely structured. It's very small. At least the country, the physical geography is large, but the number of people living there and where they live are in small places. They're very susceptible to individual pressure. So a king can have quite a significant impact upon the people in there. The king is a mover and a shaker. And we can see this in his pensions, in his patronage. So if you do something well for the king, and the king likes you, the king will give you a pension. And it's just like a pension that you get nowadays, except you get it all the way until you die. You don't have to wait until you're 70 before you get it. And about, £3,000 was more than enough for somebody at those levels to be getting pensions. And that's more than enough money. But in 1621, he was giving £5,000 the Duke of Lennox and the Dukes of Arundel and Montgomery. He was giving £4,000 to the Earls of Suffolk, and £3,000 to the Earls of Salisbury and Southampton. And so this appears to be his way of currying favor and organizing things, or at least gathering support for himself. And this is not the way that the English will rule. He's transplanting ideas from Scotland, which worked in Scotland because of the nature of Scotland, but he's bringing them down to England, and that's just not the way that we do it in England. So while he is literary and funny-looking and accomplished, he's also quite isolated. And maybe that's not a great thing. Now, he's partially isolated because he's a thinker and a talker, not a doer. He didn't really care for the daily administration of his country. And that is okay insofar as you have people who are competent to do the work for you, if you have anybody to do it for you. But also a king needs to be involved. He rarely strayed out of Hertfordshire and Suffolk, two counties in England, which is, he didn't move around and sort of get involved in things, and that's not maybe a clever thing. He's unfortunate enough to be Scottish, which means that he lacks the necessary upper-class connections with the elite. So, because he's an implant, he is the King of Scotland, and he becomes the King of England and Scotland eventually. And this is... it's a problem. He doesn't have the previous connections with anybody in England to do this. And this creates what we call a problem between court and county. So there is the inner circle, which around the king, and then there's the county outside, or the country outside. And he really doesn't have great, strong connections with either. He's generally unknown, by the population, which is maybe a little strange, and it's definitely not good. He also produces some troubling policies. One of them will be the plantation at Ulster, which is I suppose, an English colony in Ireland, so to speak. We'll talk about Ireland later. And Ireland is going to figure quite significantly in most of the English problems. He's tolerant of Roman Catholics, which in today's age, of course, is a lovely thing, but back then was not seen as a clever thing. He looked for the union of the kingdoms of Scotland and England. Not so good. Not so wanted by the English population. He loved compromise, which again, is a good thing in some times, but this was a world full of violent extremes, and sometimes you cannot compromise. He was a peacemaker in a time when being a military person was seen as being very important, and people found him menacing. Parliament in 1604, so this is really just the beginning of his reign, says the prerogatives of princes may easily and do daily grow. The privileges of the subject are for the most part at an everlasting stand. And he, of course, produced treaties, excuse me, he produced treaties on the divine right of power, which might be, and I think probably was considered to be an aggrandizement of his own position as a king. We are nowhere near maybe the absolute ruling of the monarchists in France, but we are sort of working our way on there. So by the time he ascends the throne in 1603, he is faced by really one major problem, which is money. Elizabeth had sold off crown land to pay for the Spanish War, and it had reduced the income from £150,000 a year to 111. Inflation had reduced the amount of money that Elizabeth had left him. He had inherited, I think, £430,000 of debt. He had a wife and 3 children, and each of those required a household and staff, and that all costs you money. And he had further problems in that James was not very good at understanding money in the abstract. I think somebody once said that if he had the money in his hand, he was really good at understanding what went on with it. But if it wasn't in his hand, then he had no idea what was going on. And he's very extravagant. We talked about the pensions that he was giving out to people when he came to power in England. He's very open-hearted and liked giving things to people. His Scottish income was about £60,000 a year, and most of that wasn't actually collected. He just liked giving stuff. And so by 1608, so this is only 5 years after his ascension, the crown debt stands at £597,000. He is prone to giving lavish parties, and he's prone to giving rewards to people who haven't really done anything. James Hay, who was one of his favourites, used to say, "Spend and God will send." Received £400,000 from the crown, which is about the equivalent of £4 million in today's money. And on his deathbed, left absolutely nothing. So he's profligate in his giving, and the people who are giving it to are also quite profligate too. And Parliament doesn't like this very much. And many of the Stuart problems are going to come from this problem of money and where do you get it from. So this then is where we find ourselves. James, along with his successors, his sons, and relatives, will all require money. And they will all either turn to Parliament and demand more than Parliament will give, or they will take when Parliament has said that they shouldn't. And this will set the tone for the next sort of, it's almost 100 years. Where the nature of power, the nature of the relationship of power between the monarch and Parliament is going to be explored, and the contours of it are going to be examined. And some people are obviously going to think that the king should be weighted more heavily than Parliament, and others are going to think that Parliament should be weighted more heavily than the king, or at least have a greatly expanded role than what they initially thought. And this is going to be the root of all the problems. And so for the next sort of until about the 1680s, 1690s, this is going to cause trouble. But we will see this as we go over the next few weeks to sort of see what's going on, and we'll see when we get there. So we'll stop here. Thank you.